the automatic stabilisers are built into both the framework, so it goes up, but more importantly, it's already large. And what Keynes was arguing, if people, I wish our Prime Minister would go back and look at it, is for permanent incremental infrastructure programs. We have that in all of our state budgets. I think your one here over the next 4 years is $4 billion, is it? Something in that order. The New South Wales one's over 60 billion. They are built into the system at the moment, and they're supposed to act in a counter-cyclical way. So it's a lot of nonsense for the Prime Minister to argue that we've now returned to some form of Keynesian economics. If that doesn't concern you, there are a lot of reputable economists. I'm not going to use the word consensus because I don't believe in consensus around scientific issues. Science is not a democracy. The reality is there's a lot of reputable economists that have actually estimated the multipliers that are allegedly associated with these stimulus packages being less than one. Less than one. So we're borrowing a whole bunch of money that somebody's got to pay back to put into an economy, and we get less than the less impact than the money that we actually put into the economy, and we've still got the interest payments to make at the other end, and that crowds out at that end investment. And again, the business community, and again, it requires transcending your own interests. I know that some people here are beneficiaries of the funds and the largesse that's come through stimulus packages. That's all very well, but at the other end, when they've got to raise interest rates, when there isn't enough capacity in state balance sheets and federal balance sheets to fund infrastructure, you'll be the first people crying. It is very good to have the money if you get it now, but it's certainly going to cause some problems downstream. And the thing that particularly annoys me about all of this is that there are significant infrastructure programs that all of the states have that could have been funded through the stimulus approach, which would have been consistent with a sensible rollout of an injection of funds into the economy, but we've gone for this sort of big bang approach that's now led to pressure on interest rates. And remember, the beneficiaries of the stimulus package are very narrow in an economy sense, but the disadvantage is going to come from interest rates. It's going to apply across the economy, and that is a major problem, particularly for our exporters, as we see the currency appreciate as a result of pressure around interest rates and the view around the place, particularly from where I sit, is that we'd be better off to have a look at the rest of the stimulus package and start to readjust it. There was one other point I wanted to make. How are we going for time? I'm hopefully not boring you all to death. I quoted this. This is, and I'll quote it here. It's a great quote. I quoted it in an article I wrote for the Australian. This is, and I'm sure most of you haven't seen it because it was in the Australian. Well, somebody said to me they don't read. It's not your. It would have been the Mercury, I suppose. You would have had a better run.
It is printed here.
What the
Australian?
Yeah, I know that. But this quote should be across the board. This is from the FDR's Treasury Secretary, and some people will be familiar with this. Morgenthau. He was the actually was an interesting guy. His proposal at the end of the Second World War was actually to turn Germany into an agricultural society, a peasant-based society, so they wouldn't have another war. But let's leave aside that sort of madness, which was thankfully rejected. Keynes was one of the people that argued against it. But what he did say, remember this guy was the Treasury Secretary, and I'll read the quote. This is to I think it was the Ways and Means Committee of the US Congress. He said, "We have tried spending money. We are spending more money than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. And I have just well, it should be one interest, and if I'm wrong, somebody else can have my job. I want to see this country prosperous. I want to see people get a job. I want to see people get enough to eat. We have never made good on our promises. I say that after 8 years of this administration, we have as much unemployment as we had at the start and an enormous debt to boot." Now, every time you hear, from the Prime Minister particularly, because he's been very fond of displaying his intellectual credentials in articles criticising previous economic policy, talk about stimulus and its effect. Remember that stimulus hasn't worked. In fact, monetary policy, and this is the irony of what has occurred in Australia, monetary policy wasn't allowed to work its way through. We had some additional scope. Unfortunately, because of the stimulus, we find ourselves in a position now that we're facing rising interest rates at a time when the rest of the world is still trying to stabilise. I hope that what I've said has been reasonably interesting. They asked me to be controversial, but I thought not tonight because I've already upset a couple of people on the table. But I'm happy to take some questions. I don't care if it's about other topics. I was told not to talk about global warming.
Thanks, Michael. You stay here now. Who's got the hand very keen there for the first question? So fire away.
Thank you. I confess to being a federal government employee to start with.
There's nothing wrong with that.
I guess the question I would ask is, not a long-term public servant, the short-termism of both federal and state governments based on election cycles. I would suggest to you that creates incredible deficiencies in government departments, both federal and state. And I was encouraged when I was in the States some 10 years ago looking at welfare reform, that one of the states, I think it was Wisconsin from memory, had a bipartisan approach to welfare reform, which I thought was incredibly useful and was actually having some significant benefits for the community. I would hope, and I'd like a comment from yourself, on how you might actually look at those important issues for Australians, where you can get bipartisan support that's not based on election cycles.
Well, look, I mean, that raises a whole series of issues. I've also written on reforms to the electoral system that I'd like to see, and part of those are term limits and I won't go into the salary arrangements. But look, I don't think that's the issue I'm really looking at. I think the issue comes back to this structural problems in the way things are set up. So the electoral cycle is a derivative of that. I mean, the reality is that state governments are not in a capacity, don't have the capacity when faced with periodic elections and constrained funding bases with increasing expenditure pressure to deal with reform. They can't deal with it. It seems to me that when we've had reform in this country, it's always come through external pressure on government. And you probably gather that whilst I'm not a big fan of some of the things the federal government's doing at the moment, I'm certainly a fan of what Hawke and Keating did. I think that's the model to use national leadership to drive the change through either incentives, they can be the old national competition payments or something that's meaningful, but certainly to get that structural change. And I'm talking about an incremental process. I think we've got about a decade to try and get all this right. As I said to you, I'm annoyed that we've got to waste 5 years on the healthcare agreement. I think there is bipartisan support for change to state federal funding arrangements. You know, like everybody confronts this. Doesn't matter if you're in a Liberal Party or Labor Party. If you're in state government, you confront the same problem. The problem is how you're going to fund these essential services. And what I'd like to see, and I didn't go into this, we need to abolish stamp duty. It's a regressive tax. It's a ridiculous tax. It only falls on small sectors of the property market. Why have we got this tax? How can you justify it? I was at a forum last week, as I said, and there was a well-known journalist who I won't name, whose response to the comments I've made was, well, this is all bull. What you should do is apply the taxes you currently have, the taxing powers. And I said, yeah, what are they? He said, well, you should broaden the payroll tax, increase the rate, and apply property taxes consistently across the board. Now, the problem I have with that argument is my argument is not an argument for more tax. I think our overall tax arrangements are pretty in line with what you'd expect. It's an argument about using those taxation arrangements and funding arrangements in a way that's more creative and creates the innovation that's there. I'd be the last person to argue for more taxation, and that seems to be the response that's coming now. I'll say, I won't say directly, but certainly indirectly from the Commonwealth. that the states have got themselves to blame. They would have used the existing tax arrangements, land tax and payroll tax, get rid of the exemptions and start to fund these services through that base.